not much of a singer.
You're a doer, Mr. President.
But I wrote some things down. And in the midst of the Civil War, all that turmoil, 3 days of battle, 58,000 Americans lay dead on the field of battle. Our country has never had the magnitude nor the depth of such a calamity. We had not the money nor the manpower to bury the dead properly. And of those that were buried, they were only in graves about this deep. So that when the late summer rains came, it washed the very graves open, that the bones of the patriots reached out of the graves as if asking for help. And the borough of Gettysburg and the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania were angry beyond belief. And they said, let us petition our congressional delegation so that a cemetery would be brought forth, that the dead would be buried properly.
Yes, sir.
And they said, who shall we have speak? And someone on the committee said, let us bring Edward Everett of Harvard University. And in my day, when a speaker was asked, they spoke 2 or 2.5 hours. And someone said, well, we ought to have the president. And someone spoke up and said, if he has to be here, tell him to say a few appropriate remarks.
If he has to be here.
In your terms, it might be said, get here, say something, and sit down. I knew I was not the invited speaker.
Yeah.
I worked on this address some 2 weeks before on Executive Mansion stationery at the old soldiers' home. I showed it to Secretary of State William Seward. I said, Mr. Secretary, what do you think? He said, it's a good start. I hadn't the heart to tell him it's all I had. And we arrived at Gettysburg. I did some additional touches on it the night before, and they took me out on a horse the next morning to Gettysburg Cemetery. And for the first time, when Edward Everett was done, my federal marshal, Ward Hill Lehman from Danville, Illinois, who was with me, stood up and said, ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States. First time. You must have liked it because you keep doing it. And I was fearful, for I said, I don't think this speech will scour. It's a flat failure. And so all of my carefully prepared speeches, like the Conklin letter I shared with you, and the inaugurals, I was careful. And so I didn't speak from the heart, I spoke from the paper. And so at Gettysburg, this is what I said. 77 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal.
Yeah.
Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate, we cannot consecrate, we cannot hallow this ground. The brave men, living and dead, who struggle here, have consecrated it far above our poor power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here, but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us, that from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they here gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. And just like Gettysburg, there were no applause. For folks thought I was going to continue for 2 more hours. What did I say? What could I say? I didn't address the people of the North. I didn't address the people of the South. I didn't address the people of the United States. My vision is what was to come. When the Founding Fathers wrote, all men and women are created equal, endowed with inalienable rights, those being life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, then how could an institution like the United States live half slave and half free? So I wrote this to those who would come next. What was to come of this thing you all have now learned as civil war. And you stand here as a free people in a church, living with that still imperfect Constitution, born in imperfection, continues to thrive in imperfection. But the founders said, let's put in a provision so as the will of the people changes, we can amend the Constitution. And so this document, the Emancipation Proclamation, led the country to think gradually that people would be free. And on that January day in 1865, the 13th Amendment, proclaiming slavery now illegal forever, was and I lived to see it. And we would continue to amend that Constitution so that women vote.
Yeah.
18-year-olds vote. We had an issue with alcohol, and it was illegal for a time. But the country said, some of the folks, we need to make that legal again. And it was a financial matter. It wasn't a moral question, but they didn't force it on the population.
Yeah.
So that's about this imperfect country that we have, for which you all live. Now, I wrote in cursive, and one of my little friends said, might have trouble reading it because it's in cursive. But I brought a copy for each one of you, and I think there's enough. And this is the copy that Edward Everett asked for.
Wow.
And I want to tell you how great America is. I'm standing next to W in the Lincoln bedroom in Washington City in 2005, looking at this very document. And he's standing as close to me as you are. And he says to me, you know, that's not the original. And I said, sir? And he called an aide over and he said, explain this. And they said, well, they didn't, the original's in the National Archives. They said, this is just a printer's copy. And it was pretty good. About 10 days later, I'm in a bookstore. Guess what was in that bookstore? That same copy that was on display in Washington. And I snatched it up in my hand, and I took it to a printer, and I said, can you do this? For I think there are people in the country that would like to receive their own copy. And he felt the paper, and he looked at the print, he said, I can do this. So now I get this, and that's why I brought it for you. But he told me the first batch that was printed, 1,000 copies, he said there was a hush in the print room when the final copies came off. And they looked through the edges and the corners, and no one spoke. And finally, one of them went to the owner of the company. He said, should we wrap this in plastic? And he said, well, why wouldn't you? It's a print job. And they said, but it's the Gettysburg Address. But they wrapped it. And they delivered it to me. And now, when I go, I think it's important you take it with you. Because you are the next generation.
Yes, yes.
You are going to rise up and be the government of the people.
Yeah.
By the people, for the people. We met. I know your principal. I'm going to send her a note. But I think since we met and talked, I'd like you to have the copy that I read from.
Oh my goodness.